Okay, hi. This is the World Beyond MVC. My name's Garann, like Nuno said. I work at Etsy. I'm from Austin, Texas. I wrote a book called Node for Front-End Developers. I organize a couple groups in Austin, and if you want to talk to me, find me on Twitter at Garann. So, who's using an MVC framework currently in their development? Okay, so that's a large number of you. I'm guessing that some of the ones that you're using are listed here. These are the most popular. Sorry. There. So why is this so popular? What is with the popularity of MVC, and what draws you to it? There's a long history of people using server-side frameworks with MVC in web development. Most of the most popular tools that we've used over the years on the server side have been based around MVC, or the most successful ones, like Rails, before that, .NET, Java stuff. There's a long history with MVC and the web. And you get clear components to build around. You get these models that are very easy to understand and very accessible. So that's cool because it feels natural to the way that we think about development, especially if we come from an object-oriented background. So it's kind of intuitive, right? It's nice. We don't always know where this came from, though. I thought it was interesting when I looked into it. MVC was invented by a man whose name I'm going to murder if I try to say it correctly, but Trygve Renskaug, I think. And this was in the late 1970s. And shortly thereafter, it was implemented in Smalltalk. And interestingly, when he came up with it, it had an additional fourth component that we don't talk about anymore. This editor concept, which sort of dealt with user interaction. And we'll talk about that later. But an interesting quote that I found from him was about sort of how do you define real MVC. This quote is, Jim Althoff and others implemented a version of MVC for the Smalltalk 80 class library after I had left Xerox PARC. I was not involved in this work. Jim Althoff uses the term controller somewhat differently than me, which I thought was really interesting because there we find the beginning of already this sort of confusion about what is real MVC, what constitutes real MVC, and the questions that people have about architectures in general as far as does this adhere to the original tenets of whatever this architecture was initially thought of as. So anyway, so the question I'm hoping we can talk about is whether MVC is the answer to whatever we're doing, specifically on the client side. And it's great for a lot of things. Obviously it's wonderful on the server side because you have that very clear idea of the work that a server-side web language needs to do. That's awesome. It's good for CMSs as well, just because again you have clearly defined objects and it's nice to work with them that way. Things like data entry, I mean, certainly not sexy, but data entry and MVC go hand in hand because, again, you have a very clear definition of what an object is and what the controller is going to do and what the view is going to look like. So anything where you have a bunch of clearly defined objects is good with MVC, and it works well. And more generally, anything that fits well within an object-oriented programming paradigm, which is not to say that you can't do object-oriented programming without MVC or that object-oriented programming is limiting or anything like that. But simply, when you get close to something that you can purely recognize as an object-oriented programming problem, MVC is usually a great tool. But sometimes it kind of sucks. So if you have things that you're doing where you're generating the state of an object or an even more crucially a non-object, if several things are feeding into a state that doesn't belong to really anything, that's an interesting problem. If you have a lot of complex user interactions, and those interactions are actually the data that your application wants to track, that's tricky with MVC. And if you have like controls and widgets, that doesn't necessarily fit neatly with MVC, which is more focused on the data. So a lot of client-side apps, basically, are not well suited for MVC, or as well suited for MVC as they used to be when a lot of our web pages just did, refresh, go back to the server, kind of static stuff. And speaking of that, it's overkill for things like static sites or things that you're doing with all your code on the server. So anyway, so there are architectures beyond MVC, which I'm sure everybody knows, but for some reason we don't talk as much about them as we do about MVC. And I think it's one of the problems with this, one of the reasons that we get sucked into MVC is the architecture and is the only architecture, is that we don't have really good white papers, good research on, or even good arguments for what web architectures should look like that have the pedigree that things like MVC do. So if you look at like the Gang of Four book, that's copyrighted in 1994. It was released in 1995, I think. And I don't know how many of you were active web developers at that point, but I certainly wasn't. And I don't think that many of the people who were reading that book or writing that book were fully thinking about web uses for those patterns. So at the time that most of these patterns emerged, we had the user and the developer. Were almost the same person, right? You got a program and you typed that program into your computer, and the user and the developer were the same person. And everything was done from the same command line. Or if you had a terminal, then your terminal probably wasn't going to interpret views. There was no DOM on the terminal, so you got what you put in, and everything was much different than it is obviously now on the web. And so MVC steps in and it fills that, right? It seems to, because it gives you this clear concept of the UI. The UI obviously belongs in the view layer. That's easy. That's easy to tackle. And so the original web apps, like the things that we were writing in 1996, 1997, it maps really neatly to those, because you were going to do all your work on the server, you were going to end up with this view, and you were going to send the view down, and you're done, right? But when you start to break a web app up into individual pieces, and you're doing things with JavaScript, you're doing things asynchronously, then I think it kind of falls apart. So we need to repurpose the architectures we have, the patterns that we have. And MVC is a great starting point. It works for a lot of things. It'll do in a pinch. But there are more sophisticated web apps now that don't necessarily need to limit themselves to MVC and trying to push themselves into a little MVC box. So what is actually outside MVC? Event-driven architectures are the most obvious, I think. If we're going to talk about low-hanging architectural pattern fruit, right below, or right, if it's low-hanging, is that, I don't know. But right above MVC is event-driven architectures, because obviously, I think anybody who's familiar with Node is already beginning to embrace this concept. And we can do the same thing on the client. So if the primary unit of your application is events rather than data objects, then this is a nice fit. So you have your objects, or you have your events, and those are kind of running your application. Then you have other things like your state, utility functions that you need, resources like templates. Those all kind of live together rather than living in these little triads. And then you have a bunch of code that basically subscribes to things. You have functions, getters, and setters that do the work for you for your application, and you're just basically listening for those events. And I mean, this should feel natural to you if you're an old school JS dev, if you did a bunch of work on the DOM, or if you are a server-side dev and did a lot of service-oriented architectures. So it's pretty easy to pick up, obviously. But just to look at a quick little example. So let's say you have a login button, and you're going to publish an event when, and this is all, is everybody familiar with publish and subscribe, I'm assuming? Okay, thank you. So you're going to publish a login attempt event when somebody clicks the login button, and that's going to contain the user and the password that they try to log in with. And then you're at an application level, you're going to subscribe to that, and then you'll try to update that, or you'll try to log in on the server. And so if there's success, then you'll publish another event for the user having logged in. If there's an error of some sort, then you'll just say that the login failed, and you'll publish an event for that. But again, you're not messaging anything directly. You're not manipulating any objects. You're just passing these events. So if you have a cart state object that's going to basically carry your data that you're building up here, then that could also subscribe to that login event. And when there's a successful login, you can set the values in the cart state, and then publish an additional event if you want, saying that, hey, you're ready to check out now. And you can have a renderer object that is basically going to control rendering for your entire application instead of having renderers tied to individual pieces of data. You'll have just a renderer, and it can have multiple subscribers, one of which would be subscribing to this cart ready object, so that then you draw the final cart step, whatever it would be, based on receiving that object or that event. Why do I keep saying it? And so you would have additional subscribers here on this object, and similarly, the cart state would have additional subscribers to other things that it wanted to do. But this is just sort of like a simple workflow that you could use events to navigate through that, rather than putting everything in triads and collections and whatnot. Naked objects are an interesting idea if you have a lot of widgets and controls, like complex DOM pieces in your application. So if the complexity tends to be in the interface rather than in the data, then naked objects can be kind of a cool way to tackle that, I think. And so if you did desktop development in like maybe the 90s, this might seem familiar. I don't know how desktop development is done now, or if it's done now. But this reminds me a lot of how it was doing Visual Basic. So basically, you have objects, and the rendering is a reflection of the properties within the object, essentially, right? So this actually plays out. It's very similar to MVC or MVC family, but it's more like a presenter abstraction control than MVC. But it still has that sort of concept of the triad. It's just that the triad is all contained within the object, and it's a little bit more rolled up. And then you have, of course, you still have business logic, but that lives somewhere else in the application. So these objects just control themselves, it's cool for anything where you need to compile a bunch of controls or widgets into one interface. So like, let's say we have some kind of color slider, right? And this is not actually again a complex enough object to warrant an object like this, but just let's pretend it has more properties than this. So you've got a container, the value of it, URL, which we'll get to in a minute, and then the color channel that you're working with, right? And so there's just a getter and setter on it, and when the value is set, then you're going to call an update function. The update function is messed up, but essentially it's just going to post that data to the server, to whatever URL you supplied, and then if it gets a response back, it will then attempt to render that, and let's pretend there's also a toolbox object that the color slider lives in. If a toolbox is attached, then it'll set the color on that, and then rendering the final step is pretty simple. It's just going to spit out a range control and set the color of the range control depending on the channel. So this is super simple, but that's kind of the idea. Everything that it does is contained within that object, and you don't step outside that object to do any of the work that you would want to do with that object. Pipelines, I think, is a trickier one to work with, but it makes sense if you have application state, sort of, or not application state, but state of application, state of objects, hierarchical states as basically the primary unit of your application. If you're working a lot with setting state and combined state and that kind of stuff, I think this is very cool. And it's basically just, I think of it as like successive decorators on whatever your state object is. And this is obviously really familiar if you work with jQuery. Like chaining functions together. But you can also go the other way. So you can go synchronously, like the jQuery way, and then you can go like asynchronously with callbacks. So again, super simple. Let's say that we have an initialization function. Then we want to do some simple things. We just want to render and then wire up. And so this is jQuery-like syntax here. Then we have like this function here that that runs things, and that we'll come back to this in a minute. But this run function is basically just going to loop through a list of functions and go through and call them, passing the result back in as an argument every time. So we have a couple other simple functions here that we would need for a page utility object. We have a render function, which does what you would think. A wire function, which is where that run function gets called when it's going to, for each selector that it finds that's passed in, it's going to step through a list of functions, and so it's going to use that run function to do that work. And so how that would actually be implemented would be like you have some page here with some data, and you're going to inherit from that page utils object, and then you pass in all this information, and then one of the things you pass in is an array of functions that you want to call when these selectors happen, essentially. And the synchronous way is cool, but I think it's also, I won't go into this because, has anybody worked with deferreds in jQuery or in Dojo or like that? Those, yeah, okay. I didn't know how far to go into it. So this is just really simple, assuming that you understand that concept. Like you could do this asynchronously as well and just sort of chain all your functions together, and then within each of these functions actually wait for user input. So this would be more like a true pipeline, like a command line kind of concept where you're waiting for user interaction at each step, and then you're publishing that deferred, or you're resolving that deferred and saying, okay, let's continue on to the next step. And so you could do some kind of cool stuff using utilities like that. But you need to integrate something, another tool that I wasn't going to rewrite on the slides for examples. So there you go. So basically what you should be considering when you're choosing an alternative to MVC or just choosing an architecture in general is how much decoupling is there, like, and where do you want it? Because obviously we say we want everything to be as decoupled as possible, but that's you have to tightly couple some things typically, or you have a very slow application. So you have to make those considerations. You have to figure out whether you want the application to know about itself, to be able to contain an accurate picture of itself, or whether the picture of the application can be distributed among all the objects that are within it. You have to think about how much you want to abstract away your controls. Like, do you have controls that are worth abstracting that you want to be able to reuse? Not every application does. For some of us, the level of abstraction provided just by HTML is fine. But if you have really complex stuff, maybe you do actually need to have those abstracted out. And of course, how much setup or initialization you want to have to do, and where you want to do it, if you want to do it in the application level or the object level or whatever. And I just want to touch on static sites. So static sites still need architectures, which is something we don't talk a lot about because it's definitely not sexy, but they do. And at minimum, they need something like library functionality usually, right? And if you have a library, essentially you're using whatever architectural pattern somebody else has chosen for you. There are probably hints within that architecture as to how you should structure your application, or within that library as to how you should structure your application. And so, but as soon as you choose a library, you're in effect choosing an architecture. And so you can go with the way that the library is written, or you can use libraries to build into other patterns, like I've tried to do here with jQuery, which is pretty. I don't know what architecture I would say that is, but it definitely has a certain approach to how it does things. And so there are options that you can use on static sites as well. Event-driven architectures obviously make sense. Pipelines are very. I would say that's probably where jQuery falls. And of course, you can just do RMI and do all your work on the server and kind of just punt on the issue of what your client-side architecture should be. So for static sites, you need these strong conventions even more probably than single page applications, because you have a bunch of junk everywhere, and if you don't organize it well with a good architecture, if it's not predictable, then you get more of a mess than something that has to work together and is already going to be bound together by the nature of being an application. But they are already naturally decoupled at the application level, which is kind of an advantage, but you may choose to make trade-offs there and actually have more tight coupling at the application level in favor of looser coupling with the DOM. And you can use architecture to enforce style as well, to make sure that people are actually writing good code when they work on your app in the future. One thing to pay attention to, of course, is that, again, decoupling can be painful, inversion of control can be painful. Performance changes or performance considerations definitely play into static sites, I think, more than applications, because obviously you're reloading pages. So anyway, should you use Backbone or not, right? That's the bottom line. So obviously you want to use MVC rather than nothing, but if possible, try to choose an architecture or a pattern that fits your application rather than fitting your application into the bounds of an architecture. If you're writing a pattern or a framework or something, then maybe we have enough MVC frameworks. Just saying. Maybe you could try something different, just to broaden the field. Because if we had something as accessible as Backbone for some of these other patterns, then that would be cool, and that would give people more opportunity to do that. Anyway, so I'm out of time. Please use the best tool you can find, and thank you very much.
I know it's time.